Hello to everybody in the audience, and welcome to this event on street power, citizens' protests, and polarization in Southeast Europe and Greece. I'm Karyotis, I'm the director of the Hellenic Observatory, and this is an event organized by the Hellenic Observatory, but in particular by our research group on Southeast Europe, LSEE, the research unit we have here at the LSEE on Southeast Europe and the Western Balkans. Jointly, we have this event. We want to talk about street protests and civic engagement, not only Southeast Europe, but also in the wider context, including Greece, but also the wider area from Central Eastern Europe all the way perhaps to Turkey. The event will be coordinated by my good colleague, Professor Denisa Kostovicova, to whom I pass the floor now.
Thank you, Vasilis. And welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon. As you know, people have taken to the streets of Greece, Serbia, North Macedonia, and further afield in Turkey and in Hungary. And public outbreak of dissatisfaction with authorities mirrors country-specific configurations of power, governance, and state-society relations. But if you look specifically at Greece and Southeast Europe, common to all the protests currently is that the governance failures have become a matter of life and death. So today we will discuss different forms and strategies of citizens' mobilization, as well as the risks and limitations of street power with a panel of fantastic experts. All of them bring to us years of expertise and thinking about various aspects of civil society protest and mobilization. I will introduce our speakers in the speaking order, and tonight the first one to speak will be Professor Paula Pickering. She'll be followed by Professor Georgios Karyotis, and last but not the least, we will hear from Professor Nebojša Vladisavljevic. I will now introduce all of them, and then I will turn the floor over to our first speaker. Professor Paula Pickering is Richard S. Pearl's Professor of Government and Faculty Affiliate of the Global Research Institute at William & Mary in the US. Her research focuses on peace building, governance, and civic activism, mainly in Southeast Europe. Professor Pickering is co-editor of, most recently, Activism in Hard Times in Central and Eastern Europe, People Power, and on another volume on Central and East European politics, changes, and challenges. She is also the author of one of the seminal books on the Balkans. It's titled Peace Building in the Balkans, The View from the Ground Floor, with Cornell University Press. And she's authored and co-authored a huge number of articles published in top journals. Since 2007, Professor Pickering has mentored the international community engagement project called the American Bosnian Collaboration Project, in which her university, William & Mary, and the University of Sarajevo partner and co-teach and conduct research on informal educational initiative to promote intercultural competence among Bosnian youth. Professor Pickering worked as human rights officer for the Organization Security and Cooperation in Europe's mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also as an analyst on Eastern Europe at the US State Department in the early 1990s. We are very glad to have you, Paula, with us tonight. Following Paula, we will have Professor Georgios Karyotis address us. He is Professor of Security Politics in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow. His main research and teaching interests lie in the areas of securitization theory, crisis management, protest and voting behavior, and migration studies. Among others, he was a principal investigator on one of the leading projects funded by the UKRI on the skills and aspirations of young Syrian refugees and the corresponding attitudes of host populations in Greece, Lebanon, and the UK. His research, too, has been published in top academic journals. He is currently serving as the convener of the Evidence Group on Asylum and Migration, which is a core group of the Scottish Government's New Scots Initiative. He is also the co-convener of the Greek Politics Specialist Group, which is a network of 450 academics, which received the Group of the Year award in 2019 from the UK's Political Studies Association. And lastly, Professor Nebojša Vladisavljevic is full professor at the Faculty of Political Science at University of Belgrade. After completing PhD at London School of Economics and Political Science, he taught comparative politics and national and ethnic conflict regulation also at the LSEE. Professor Vladisavljevic's research interests include authoritarianism and democratization, social movements and revolutions, nationalist mobilization and ethnic conflict regulation, with a particular focus on post-communism and the Balkans. He is the author of Serbia's Anti-Bureaucratic Revolution, Milosevic, the Fall of Communism and Nationalist Mobilization, and more recently of The Rise and Fall of Democracy in Serbia after Milosevic. Professor Vladisavljevic has also published widely in top leading international academic journals. So we are very privileged to have you and all your expertise in one spot, so to speak. So we'll proceed with each speaker speaking between 10 and 12 minutes, which will leave us enough time, hopefully, for the discussion. And we will invite your questions that you can post in the Q&A section on your screens. If you're using Twitter, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSEE Greece. Also, please note that we are recording this event and that the recording will be posted if we have no technical difficulties, and it will be available on YouTube channel afterwards. So I think we are now ready to start. Paula, will you please share your screen and we'll get going.
Yes, sorry. Oh, that's my wrong presentation. Sorry about that. I have my own notes and then I have a different presentation that I will share with you. Just 1 second. Sorry, I had some technical difficulties before.
So while Paula is mounting the PowerPoint, so just to say, we'll have the presentations, 3 presentations of 10 to 12 minutes. Professor Pickering, then Professor Karyotis and Professor Vladisavljevic will follow. And after that, you can start.
Hello, would you like to share? Would you like me to share the presentation?
I have it ready now. Sorry, sorry about that.
Yeah. And as I said, you can post your questions and we'll have a discussion afterwards. Perfect.
Right, so I hope everyone can see my slides now. Just thanks to Vasily, Denisa, and colleagues at LSE's Hellenic Observatory for this opportunity. I'm honored to join my panelists. I think it's a very important time for us to be discussing the power of civic action as we see the spread beyond Central and Southeastern Europe of threats to democratic rights, norms, and institutions and civic responses to them. I think we have a lot to learn from the region. I'm going to start off our conversation by discussing some findings from activism and hard times in Central and Eastern Europe, the co-edited book with Patrice McMahon and Dorota Pietracris, to talk about when civic activism, and in particular contentious activism, matters. So the research questions driving our book include how civic activism has evolved as public space has shrunk, and what are the conditions under which activists achieve their goals. Our approach is a very collaborative one, and one that is mainly qualitative. It's part of a larger project where we collected all sorts of quantitative and qualitative data. But this book, we really wanted to elevate the voices and experiences of civic activists through co-authoring with civic activists and providing longer profiles of activists who have been working over long periods of time. So essentially, we wanted to work with activists rather than treat them as subjects. We look at cases across the different subregions of Central and Eastern Europe, including Bosnia and Herzegovina, Hungary, Poland, Russia, and Ukraine, although we bring in other countries in the region. And obviously, these countries have varying levels of political openness. And important for our book, we used a broad conception of civic activism, publicly oriented voluntary activity with a variety of goals, a variety of social and political, mainly policy goals. We also look at a variety of forms of civic activism, including protests, but also social movements, digital activism, volunteering, participation in civil society organizations, and ad hoc participation that complies with the norms of civility. So we're looking at groups that use nonviolent methods. Our book looks at more than protests clearly, but my talk will focus mainly on the implications of our larger research project for protests. So backsliding and hybrid regimes that incorporate elements of authoritarianism and democracy create opportunities for civic activism with all sorts of goals. And my co-panelists have also talked about this. And I think it's important to mention that some of this civic activism has goals that are pro-democratic and thus capable of exercising social accountability of elected leaders, but some have non-democratic goals, and they're important to be considering when we consider the overall impact of even pro-democratic civic action. Weak institutions of accountability, whether it's in hybrid regimes or simply democratic regimes that are not functioning well, really make it difficult to work within the formal institutions, and they compel pro-democratic civic action to take contentious forms, including protests. And we see this quite often, I think, including now in the region. So our studies suggest the conditions under which civic activism matters. We found that civic activists who creatively adapted their strategies to be resilient were more likely to make progress towards their goals. These activists strategically used a toolkit of different strategies to bring change. They cultivated allies outside and, if possible, inside institutions. They seized on opportunities, however small, to mobilize populations. They strengthened their links with citizens, which in Southeastern Europe has been challenging since the end of communism. And they improved their communication, both with citizens and towards authorities. They took these steps after experiencing setbacks, sometimes many setbacks over years, government efforts to demobilize citizens, and their critical reflection about what was needed to achieve change. So a prominent example towards the end of the writing of our book is the example of Polish activists who mobilized voters in the 2023 parliamentary elections to oust the illiberal regime. This success resulted not from an overnight effort to turn out people to vote, but by years of persistent work by civic activists who were working to address citizens' problems. Right? In fact, in all cases where democratic backsliding has recently been reversed, civic action has played a significant role. So I want to break down these into 5 takeaways, and then I'll turn it over to my co-panelists. In terms of our first takeaway, that is for civic activists to develop allies and coalitions. Forging coalitions among civic groups that have complementary skills helps civic activists pool their skills. It helps them bridge social and sometimes political divides and to amplify their power, which is otherwise theory fragmented. An example of this is a coalition of environmental groups that got a law in Bosnia-Herzegovina's federation passed that banned the construction of new mini hydroelectric dams that produced very little electricity but threatened drinking water and sources for crops. They used a variety of strategies. Some of these included working within institutions, using public hearings, legislation, participating and running for election, but they also use contentious activism to bring attention to these problems. These include protests and encampments, including by the women of Krušica, who are shown in the photo, who camped out for 500 days in order to prevent the illegal construction of a dam. This coalition importantly bridged social divides, which are many ethnic, regional, socioeconomic in Bosnia-Herzegovina, by linking grassroots activists like Jena Krušica with regional, national, and also European non-governmental organizations that were skilled in advocacy. A second takeaway is to start action at the local level. Taking advantage of political opportunities at the local level gives civic activism better chances to respond to what are often concrete problems within local communities, and then to bring tangible change. Instead, the national level is a much more contentious level that is difficult to bring change about immediately. I think one example of this includes civic activists in North Macedonia, who in 2016 brought together activism on a variety of problems and cultivated allies with other civic organizations, with political opposition parties, and also with the EU to ultimately work to oust illiberal rulers there. These movements started on focusing on specific problems such as police abuse. They engaged students who were angry about changes in student exams and fees and undermining the autonomy of universities, and non-transparent urban renewal projects such as Skopje 2014. And then ultimately this included wiretapping. Activists frame these specific problems as symbols of much larger ones that they connected with the national regime.
I think we lost Paula.
We lost Paula there.
We'll wait for a few seconds.
Yeah. Are we going to be able, if we need to stop? Yes, so she's so she mentioned 2 takeaways, but out of 5. So maybe when she rejoins us, she will be able to continue. But I just suggest that now we continue with Georgios. Yeah, would you mind sharing your slides, Georgios?
Can you see my slides and hear me? Yes, wonderful. Sorry about Paula's interruption. I'll pick up the pace here and I will speak about Greece, which is a remarkable case from which we can learn some more generalizable lessons about how protest movements emerge, how they evolve, and what they do for society and politics. I will draw on research that we've been doing for the last 15 years with Wolfgang Rudik from the University of Strathclyde to understand initially the austerity mobilizations. But before we go into the details, we need to make a very important point that protest culture, the context is what determines how likely mobilizations are going to be. And Greece stands out as a country with one of the most advanced protest cultures across the world. This is a survey held by the World Value Survey, where in 1999, Greece recorded the highest ever record of participation in lawful demonstrations in one's lifetime, 48%. This is a very high level of socialization into protest. Goes back to protests in the 90s, socioeconomic, both as well as nationalist. But more recently, we've had student uprisings in 2008 in response to a police shooting. We have waves of anti-austerity protests. We've had nationalist protests in response to the Prespa agreement. And currently, since 2023, we have ongoing street politics in response to the railway accident at Tempe. So, protest is endemic. Protest is frequent in Greece, and it happens across the country with some seasonal effects and some concentration in urban centers. Lots of opportunities then for protesters to take part. And we studied this with Wolfgang Rudik. Here you see him looking at what separates those that participate in protests from those that support a movement. Who are the new participants in anti-austerity protests and how protest movements evolve? We looked at the broader politics of extreme austerity in the case of Greece. And for all of this, we are analyzing primary data collected through telephone surveys at regular instances, which has been funded by primarily the British Academy through two small research grants and support from our institutions, the University of Glasgow and Strathclyde University. Anti-austerity protest is a mass movement that begins in 2010. 23% of participants in our survey declared participation in demonstrations in 2010. And what we see is that this movement primarily has the characteristics of an old social movement. It is male, left-wing, trade union membership that drives support for this movement, but fundamentally, it is prior protest participation that is the strongest predictor. 80% of those participating in protest in 2010 had taken part in some form of protest before, and they believe that protests can bring about policy changes. In 2011, this evolves with some expansion of the protest repertoire from demonstrations and strikes to also the occupation of public spaces and connective action, claims about direct democracy as well as end to austerity. But still, if you analyze the empirical data, we find that these characteristics of this second wave very much are similar to the first wave. Despite claims about social media driving this, actual participation doesn't seem to be connected with digital activism. By wave 3, we see the transfer of mobilization from the streets gradually to the political arena. Support for protest now attracts some new type of participants, younger, with higher interpersonal trust, post-materialist values, and social media effects increase support, but mainly increase support for voting for Syriza, the party that embraced the movement and had electoral success, becoming the government in January 2025. More recently, we have a different type of movement emerging that is more closer to a conservative identity. Religion and nationalism is important in mobilizing this. This is in response to the naming of the neighboring former Yugoslavic Republic. Negative emotions drive that. Unlike the third wave of the austerity protest, which had a lot of positive messages of hope and change, here we see anger, fear, humiliation, national worries, and remobilization of protest movements that were conservative and nationalist, such as the Macedonia protest movement or the pro-European, pro-membership, pro-referendum in 2015, and a negative association with left-wing protest movements. All of this provides a very strong potential for active remobilization and protest, and we see that in the Tempe rail accident. The first question might be, how big is this? In our survey, we see that 21% claimed participation. Our survey was conducted at the end of January 2024, so that's before the 1-year anniversary. So our results here capture only the first wave of mobilization, and what we see is mass public support for the movement itself. About 80% of the population support the movement. The average age is 47 years old, very similar to the austerity and the Tempe mobilization and the Prespa mobilization. 79% again have taken part in some form of demonstrations, the remobilization effect. They are dissatisfied with democracy in Greece, and they believe that protest can be an effective way to press for changes in policy. But it's emotions that drives this. It's negative emotions, and it's anger. Anger that, unlike previous protest movements, is shared among protesters and non-protesters. So very high levels of anger in the Greek society. And we can draw attention, a little bit more focus on the affective elements by asking participants how much do you like other previous movements, for example, and here we see polarization in emotions. You either strongly dislike or strongly like the anti-austerity protest movement. 15% of the population have forgotten about this. It's 10 years old. The Prespa agreement again produces polarization, affective polarization. Either you like them or you don't like this movement. But Tempe is different. There is, at least before this movement became weaponized in media and political discourse, there is widespread appeal in the emotions of the general population, perhaps because the accident involved the death of young people. It's very relatable, a lot of grief, and a lot of framing and salience at sporadic moments in time. Looking at emotions more closely, we start to get an idea of what separates Tempe protesters from non-participants. And again, we see here that Tempe protesters like austerity protest far more than non-participants. They clearly like the Tempe rail accident protests to a huge degree, as do non-participants. But we see some differences here on broader issues. Support for the Palestinian movement seems to be much higher among Tempe protesters. Maybe there is something from global politics that affects contemporary political behavior in Greece. It's something I will return to. We also see polarization around partisanship, but this is fundamentally and holistically negative across both Tempe protesters and non-participants. Perhaps you can see that the Tempe protesters have far more negative emotions towards parties. The scale for this is 0 to 10, and all parties seem to be seen in negative light in this slide, and that is related to an extent to blaming dynamics. If we compare the two groups, we see that Tempe protesters, of course, predictably blame the current government more than non-participants, but overall you see that blame is diffused among both the current and previous governments, and it also attracts a lot of attention on structural issues, whereas the discourse of the government about individual human error appeals to non-participants, less so to Tempe protesters. And one thing that stands out as significant here is that Tempe protesters seem to have more negative attitudes and blame capitalism more, but overall, both groups blame corruption more than anything else for the accident, a finding that is identical to the austerity blame dimensions, where corruption in Greece was again the #1 factor. Trust is very low. That is a concern for the political system in Greece. Trust in key institutions is very low, and that does seem to matter. Certainly, if you don't trust the current government, you're far more likely to participate in protests, our analysis find. But also, there are some further concerns here about the decline of support for key state institutions, which requires careful assessment and monitoring. Tempe protesters, if we turn to socioeconomic issues, are more concerned about deprivation, cost of living, being able to get a job or find a job or pay the bills. But this doesn't matter in terms of actual participation in protests, we find. They're also more likely to be anti-privatization, anti-capitalism. But again, that doesn't matter as much as a finding, perhaps surprising, that those people that believe that Greece needs the stronger border controls and sea patrols to reduce immigration waves, militarization of border controls is rejected by Tempi protesters, we find, and this remains statistically significant. So there's something about human rights discourses and ethical views that appeals to Tempi protesters. And there's certainly, as always in every crisis, framing matters perhaps more than anything, and media framing is something that we can look at. We can see that Tempi protesters overall watch television less than non-protesters, and we find that this matters. People that watch TV are less likely to participate in protests. People that watch, that follow newspapers and magazines in Greece are far more likely to participate in Tempi protests. There is some framing dynamics that requires a discussion there to understand what this happens. So if we summarize what matters in terms of the mobilization for this more recent wave, we see that economic deprivation, ideology, and political efficacy matter for supporting the movement in Tempi, but actually do not predict participation in protest. Instead, it's prior protest experience, remobilization, that drives this. And fascinatingly, it remobilizes protesters that were anti-austerity, protesters that were against the Prespa agreement, and even COVID-19 protesters. The drivers of participation, newcomers to the movement, are likely to be younger, but also trade union members. They are likely to be influenced by their emotions, and they seem to be linked to some ethical discourses, opposition to border controls, peace movements, media consumption and trust are the two final things that we find matters. And to conclude, we are in a situation then here that Greece produces protest and is likely to continue to do so because it is easy for those that have already taken part once to remobilize. This is a volcano situation where a large reservoir of people are likely to take part in future protests. But the Tempi protest, unlike the austerity protest, recruits more diverse veteran protesters, not just those that participated in austerity or Prespa, both. It lacks a clear motivational component in terms of what the demand is, other than a demand for justice, which is not clearly tied to a specific party politics, at least not mainstream parties. And it's not rational choice about the belief of efficacy that matters. That, in the end, does not make a difference. It's emotions, it's distrust, it's media framing that fuel participation. So this is not a populist movement, it appears, from our preliminary analysis of wave one, but it's popular. It does believe in democracy. It's not anti-democracy, but it also believes in human rights and attracts a left-leaning, but also more diverse ideologically profile. And all of this comes at a critical moment for Greece, a critical moment where global politics produce crisis, produce justice demands, produce polarization, produce risks and opportunities. And this is something that the governments collectively have to negotiate in Greece, both the current and future ones, because the underlying motivation here is the sense that the relationship between the government, the key Greek institutions, and the people has been needs to be repaired. It needs to be become more accountable. There is a need for responsive relationships between state and the public. Otherwise, any future Greek government is likely to face mass protest mobilization in response to any issue that attracts salient public and media attention. I will stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Georgios. So I will now ask Nebojša to look at what we can learn from the case of the protests in Serbia, and then I will return to Paula for those remaining three takeaways, which will nicely wrap it up from a different perspective.
Thank you. Well, no PowerPoint on my side. I'll speak about current protests in Serbia in the broader historical and institutional context. We've had massive protests in Serbia in the last 5 months or so in response to the death of 15, actually now 16 people at the railway station in Novi Sad, which is the second largest city, as concrete canopy of the station actually fell upon commuters. And most people believe, and now there is some evidence that actually this is because of massive corruption and kind of poor quality public works. This railway station was reopened after full renovation just a few months before the tragedy, actually. Now, protests started very soon after this incident, and these were essentially opposition protests initially, and then citizens kind of organized themselves in large cities in daily protests. But then students took over after a month or so. So students are now at the center stage. What they've done was to occupy all schools of all state universities, and there have been no lectures, seminars, exams since early December in any of 5 state universities. Students also tried to mobilize other groups. First, they organized 5 massive protests in all large cities, including the capital, Belgrade. And what tells you a little bit about the scale of the protest is that each of these 5 protests was larger than those massive demonstrations that removed Milosevic from power in October 2000. And second, students kind of initiated a range of protest marches across the country. They marched for tens of kilometers or more across the country through villages, small towns, and were essentially received as liberators, kind of extraordinary scenes there. When it comes to forms of protest, obviously it's non-violence, but students organized kind of by following a form of direct democracy. So these protests have been highly decentralized, leaderless, essentially depersonalized, and students have made decisions in the plenary sessions or the so-called plenums, as they call them, which is a form of direct democracy with public deliberation, equal participation, and majority decision-making. Now, there are different interpretations of this. Some claim that it's ideological, but my argument is more that it's kind of situationally based, because students in other countries in the region used plenums in previous years. Students used direct democracy to actually mobilize other students who were largely uninterested in politics until a few months ago. And also this has been very useful and effective in avoiding repression. And we can perhaps come back to this in Q&A if you are interested. But what is interesting about this wave of protest is that it's went well beyond students. You have massive strikes of teachers in high schools, primary schools. Probably over half of schools have been under strike for several months now. You have pupils, especially older ones, who copy students and block schools. You have parents supporting pupils and teachers against government representatives. It's some sort of social movement arising in primary and secondary education. There have been protests by farmers across the country for months now. Bar Association held a month-long strike. Actors, artists, all actually protested. And we've seen interesting coalition forming. I mentioned the one in education. But also you have farmers protesting together with students. So when students march, they're followed by tractors, kind of farmers protect them. Or, bikers go together with students to protect them against government thugs. So essentially what we have was non-violent protest, and people are kind of patient and kind of joyful and kind of ready to protest as long as it takes, because the experience tells people that if you want political change, then you need to kind of wait for it and take it one step at a time. Otherwise, you may end up in repression. Well, when it comes to political fallout so far, 2 ministers resigned initially in November. Nobody cared. Government resigned in late February again. Protests continued and expanded. Essentially, at this point, we have deadlock. On one hand, we have the government that has lost the capacity to rule, which is increasingly unpopular and weak. And on the other hand, we have a mobilized society which still cannot prevail over the government. So this is what we've had in the last 2 or 3 months. But what really matters most, I think, is to put these current protests and the crisis they engendered into a broader kind of historical and institutional context, because only then you can get the point about prospects. It's important to look at these last protests in the context of previous protests, kind of recurrent protest waves in the last few years since late 2018. So we had essentially a weekly protest of tens of thousands across large cities for 6 months then, and then again 2 years ago over mass shootings when we had 16 youngsters killed. Government was blamed for inadequate reaction. And then more recently, last year, we had a culmination of protest against lithium extraction. This is a kind of flagship project by government and Rio Tinto, which risks environmental degradation of a large scale. Protests went beyond large cities, moved down to small places across the country, and this is highly unpopular. I mean, the lithium extraction. So you need to look at these protests today as the culmination of previous waves of protest and forms of action that we see today also as the continuation of what we had in previous years. And then obviously we need to go even further back to the 1990s, because what we've seen in the last few years, these recurrent large protest waves against authoritarian rule, essentially, not just against corruption, we've had in the 1990s against the Milošević rule in 1991, 1992, probably most famously in 1996 and 1997 with 3 months of daily protest against election fraud across the country. And then 1999 and 2000 when massive demonstrations toppled Milošević. So essentially the context, the institutional context is the same. In the 1990s and in the last decade, we had a hybrid regime, essentially competitive authoritarian regime, which is a regime with multi-party competitive elections, but elections that are not free and fair, which you have some independent media, but media freedoms are systematically subverted, and in which you have the systematic abuse of public resources in favor of the government and against the opposition and regime critics. And in this context, as my research on the protests in the 1990s tells me, this sort of context actually facilitates protests. It provides legal opportunities for political opponents to organize themselves, to confront the government within and outside political institutions, but simultaneously kind of creates grievances because it systematically violates all these legal avenues for confrontation with the government. So you get some sort of a combustible mix, which, especially in those countries in which you have protest tradition, like in Serbia, then you get quite a lot of protest. And this sort of permissive context for popular challenges actually guides challengers towards non-violence, even those who are not principally oriented towards violence, but more instrumentally. That's one point. The second point is that these protests, especially if they are prolonged, massive in terms of scale, and if they kind of are recurrent, they strongly shape these regimes. Obviously, in the short term, they may trigger a political crisis and extract major concessions from regime incumbents in terms of policy reversals or dismissals of officials or worse. But what is the most interesting point, and then that ties into what I was talking about earlier, they have strong effect in the long run in terms of sort of a constitutive effect on both regime forces and opposition forces, because they shape the identities, interests, and capacities of authoritarian elites and opposition forces. Kind of this political polarization that occurs in these protest waves actually vacates the pushes those people in the middle towards both sides. So it polarizes society. It kind of undermines popular support for authoritarian rulers and undermines their capacity to suppress protest. And then in terms of opposition forces, it strengthens their organizational resources, their networks, and also kind of provides incentives for coalition building and increases the popularity of the opposition. So kind of going back to what we have these days, we need to look at current protest in a longer sort of perspective, especially in those, when you take into account those protests in the last few years. We see the accumulation of discontent over time, growing scale of protest. We see weaker authoritarian rule and more personalistic over time. We see new and opposition and old opposition actors coming together, and we see the younger generation now highly politicized. And just briefly to conclude, I was talking about this deadlock that we have between the weak government and kind of a mobilized society, which is still not sufficiently strong. One option is that we go to political change, substantial one, probably via interim coalition government, which the opposition proposes, which would organize free and fair elections. And this is probably the more likely route. But there is also the other option, which is the Turkey option, which is the closing down of political competition and the suppression of protests. So yeah, I'll leave it at that point and we can continue in Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Paula, would you like to please continue? And I'm not sure if I may suggest, yes, you have your slides ready, so we can go straight, but I can't. Mm-hmm.
Can you see the slides?
Yes, yes, excellent. Yeah, so yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so sorry again for the technical problems. So just to build on a couple of things that my panelists have talked about, I think the use of horizontal networks in these protests is very common, and it counters charges of elitism by those who are active by encouraging this deliberative democratic decision-making. This was used by the women's protests in Poland and by many other protest actions. A fourth takeaway is to improve communication. As my co-panelists were talking about, all of these movements combine online and offline activism. They're very careful in their framing. They choose framing that resonates broadly with citizens, which helps them mobilize, and they make clear, common sense demands for concrete action that I think increases the possibilities for change. And going back to the environmental movements that Nebojša referenced, the Eco Forum Zenica, and in Poland, Smog Alert improved air quality by using an array of strategies, but by portraying air pollution in an apolitical frame as a public health problem, not as a global warming problem, and by demanding common sense and clear action by authorities, including measurements of air quality, investment in new technology, and simple enforcement of the law. And the final takeaway is the importance of critical reflection, as our activists spoke about the importance of critically reflecting on synthesizing about what worked, what didn't work in the past, including participation in prior waves and in use of different strategies so that they can develop new ones. In Hungary, Coalition Civilizatio forced, along with the EU, the Hungarian government to repeal its first law restricting civic groups receiving foreign aid. They did this by bringing together a very loose network of civic groups that prioritized the common ground about repealing the law that put all of them at risk. But they learned this approach after a 2014 attempt to form a coalition that was much tighter and rigid, fell apart. And then I wanted to end by just raising some issues by this particular example. The Hungarian government has proposed a new law, a sovereignty law that is now at the European Court of Justice. This is even more restrictive. I think it's an indication of authoritarian learning. So as civil society groups are learning, also the authoritarians are learning and sharing and adapting. And I think this is even more important to understand as we're in a global rise of autocrats, right, which create an international environment where it's much more difficult for democratic civic activism to flourish. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. I would like to invite the questions, and there are quite a few of them coming in our question and answers function through the website. But just before we transition to the questions, I would just like to sort of connect some themes, and it is kind of very interesting to see how ideas and observations connect and apply across different cases. So Paula started us off by telling us that the closure at the national level at the top, right? So democratic backsliding, rise of authoritarianism, creates an opening and opportunity for action. We've heard from Georgios and also from Nebojša, who put the protests in Serbia in a larger sort of longitudinal, as we say, perspective, the importance of repeat participation, right? And perhaps there is an element for certainly there is an element in Serbia of almost intergenerational participations, where you hear parents often saying, I've participated and now my children are participating. What I also picked up was very interesting from all of your three talks was the importance of engaging the base, but beyond the activists, right? So you made in different ways the distinction between protesters and citizens, and therefore the importance of communication. And I think both Nebojša and Georgios in particularly, and in Paula's slides, actually, we see the importance of sort of this affective side, emotional side, whether it is anger or it is joy, and maybe also without in any way minimizing or downplaying the seriousness of the issue, we also see a humor, right, as a form of resistance in this context. So there is a lot to unpack, including the transnational dimensions, which are not just, as you said, kind of horizontal learning in terms of protesters seeing being aware of other people protesting. For example, we've seen in Turkey a remarkable number of slogans and posters supporting protesters in Serbia. But also, as you said, Paula, this important dimension of transnational authoritarian learning. So maybe I'll just start with the first couple of questions from George Salasidis, who is interested about evidence of the success of the protests. So how do protests work? Is there any evidence that protests may work? I think, Paula, maybe you could elaborate. You just almost ended on that note. And the question that they may be hijacked by certain pressure groups. So let's just address that question, and then we'll move on. But please, I'll invite all the panelists to contribute.
Yeah, so that's a really great question about the evidence for protest working. So I tried to provide examples where there are concrete outcomes, but it's important, I think, to judge the goals of the people engaged in the protests. So sometimes they list very, very clear goals of what they would like. I know the Serbian protesters now have very clear goals. And so we want to take a look to see if they were able to meet those goals. In a lot of cases, like I just shown in Poland, the women's strike, in Hungary, removing the restrictive civil society law, even in these environmental actions, there are some initial successes, such as you get a law. In the Women's March, they actually got the law voted down, but then in the long term, they lost the battle because the Constitutional Court basically eliminated the reproductive rights. So this is something that the civic activists are aware of, that sometimes their initial goal can be met in a rather superficial way by authorities, then hoping to, for example, not implement a law or to shift the arena to a different area of winning a victory over the protesters. So as Nebojša mentioned, I think it's very important to be savvy about shuffling governments and superficially firing low-level officials to say that you've tackled the problem is not really getting at a larger problem, and the activists need to be in it for the long haul with that patience, right, in order to achieve their goals.
Thank you, Paula. Would anyone else like Georgios or Nebojša to comment?
I may add a little bit on the goals, actually, of different groups in current protests in Serbia. I mean, it's not obvious that they share goals. If you look at students, they have very kind of concrete demands which relate to a criminal responsibility. I mean, responsibility in courts. And when it comes to political accountability for those responsible for those shoddy public works and corruption related to this specific incident. And also they demand accountability of those who actually were involved in physical attacks on students in protests. So these kind of look like very narrow goals, and opposition often invites students to broaden up their perspective to, to demand free and fair elections and demand Vucic's resignation, that sort of a thing. And students have rejected this because they want to kind of stay kind of autonomous They do not want to be seen as pawns of the opposition. But then again, this is kind of at the kind of manifest level. If you look at student goals, you see that the government cannot really fulfill all those demands, because then massive corruption would be obvious to everybody. So the very focus on very narrow goals has kind of undermined the government and its popularity among large sections of the population. So, I mean, ultimately you get to the same point. Even without demanding free and fair elections, students have done this job of undermining government. So it's just the question of kind of moving to the next stage. So again, it's not just about these explicit goals, it's more about the context within which they are set and how they play out in this interaction between different sorts of actors.
Thank you, Nebojša. We can maybe move on to the next question that we have from Professor Maria Daskalaki, who is Professor of Organization Studies at Oxford Brookes University in the UK. And she has a question for Georgios. And this has to be this is about the gender dimension of the protests, in the sense that you said that the 2010, the first wave of protests was very male. And what do you think of, I mean, how do you get to that conclusion? And also, what was the sort of gender profile of those protests in wave 2? As well as whether you have information about socioeconomic status and other characteristics of the protesters. I think that would be quite also interesting to reflect on the diversity or maybe homogeneity of protesters from your cases, Nebojša and Paula. But Georgios, could you please start?
Thank you very much, Professor Daskalaki, for your questions. Gender is an important dimension. All of the variables that we discuss have an impact on attitudes. The question then is, what actually drives participation in protests? The way we study that, beyond the descriptives, beyond the comparisons of groups that I've mainly shared with you, is we run a regression analysis and determine, once you put all of these potential influences together, what is actually statistically significant as a predictor of participation in actual protest. So gender matters as a statistically significant predictor, controlling for everything else, for the first austerity wave and for the second austerity wave. Being male is a predictor of participation in these demonstrations. And that is controlling for other issues. And is also linked to biographical availability. Demonstrations may be seen as dangerous. Generally, prior research has also identified that there is a bias in favor of male participation in demonstrations. Now, in wave 3, that disappears. Gender is no longer a statistically significant predictor in austerity, and it doesn't seem to be a statistically significant predictor when it comes to either PRESPA or TEMPI. So that's how we study this. Your second question was about socioeconomic status, and we do have very detailed statistics and data about the profile of participants. We can look at the type of sector of the economy they work in, the type of organization, jobs, education, from which we can learn some class dynamics. From what I recall, this matters for support for the movement, but in the end doesn't matter for actual participation in the movement. I think that is your two questions. Happy to share all of this. A lot of this has already been published on the austerity, and we have a lot of novel unpublished data that we're currently working on for a book project.
Paula, is there anything that you maybe could contribute about diversity of protesters? And maybe I'll move on afterwards to Nebojša to ask him, because when we talk about protests in Serbia, we talk about students' protests, right? So that, to what extent that then determines the support, right? That in a way, these are not opposition protests by the opposition. So on one hand, they're political, and on the other hand, they are apolitical, right? And the fact that there are students, there are somebody's children's, grandchildren's, nephews and nieces there also kind of may play an important role in terms of how others may be socialized and brought into fold to support these protests just by the virtue of the fact who the protesters are, which of course may not be the same similar dynamics elsewhere, because, for example, in the case of Greece, as you said, it's what the trigger was very important, right? The death of young people on a train obviously is rather different from nationalist protests versus austerity protests. Paula.
Yeah, so I think it depends on the protest. I haven't looked only at, narrowed down the civic action of looking only at the protests. We did do nationally representative surveys in our cases. And in Bosnia-Herzegovina, there's no significant impact for gender dynamics. But of course, if we look at Poland and the women's strike, while there were clearly men who were engaged in that strike, there were predominantly women working on that issue. And I would say they confronted also counter protesters and had some challenges and concerns there. The other thing I wanted to mention is that there are some interesting gender dynamics. Multiple civic activists we work with talked about they had to make a very strong effort to bridge generational divides. And this is maybe a question I have to my co-panelists. So for example, the Polish women who participated in the strike, in the those who participated in Euromaidan who were older said that initially they weren't all that welcome in those protests, that the younger women and the younger students didn't recognize the work that they had done earlier, decades earlier, on those particular issues. And it wasn't until kind of explicit efforts to bridge those divides and connect young women with older women, for example, and to bring in the Euromaidan kind of older people once violence occurred to help protect the younger participants, that they were able to present a united front and really make some more progress on their goals.
Okay. Thank you, Paula. Nebojša.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any data, but just based on my observation, I think in current protests in Serbia, we had more women than men. First, in the last few years, we had more women in university education than men, and that is reflected in student protests. And I mean, they don't have leaders, but they have temporary representatives from one occasion to another. And when you see who talks to the media, who organizes things, it's more often it's women than men. Then the backbone of current protests has been teacher strikes and protests. And in primary schools and high schools, you have women essentially. I guess it's probably 70–80% or even more, depending on schools. And they've been the backbone of protests, very effective at that. Obviously, when you come to farmers, that's different. It's mostly men. But overall, I think women have been prominent in leadership, but also when it comes to broader kind of protesters. And there is another thing that may be one reason why we didn't have much repression, at least one of the reasons. There is anecdotal evidence from our media in the last few years that when some conflicts are expected at protests, then they send women reporters, not men, because they know that the police will treat them more nicely than men. And the very fact that you have quite a few women protesting, it's kind of undermines this urge to beat up protesters because, there are large sections of society which are traditionally tend to beat women. It's a bit of a no-no. So yeah, but that's just anecdotal.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next question, which is by Sisi Papagiannidi, who is banking executive from Greece. And the question is to George, saying that in Greece, protests and related marches have ceremonial characteristics. Would it not be interesting in your research to look at the social dimensions of the street actions, and there's the need to reproduce more ancient street ceremonies where socialization and religious bonds prevailed? So looking at some street actions in history, maybe for those of us who are not specialists on Greece, you could tell us more what is really meant by these questions, the ceremonial characteristics and ancient street ceremonies, so we better understand the question. Thank you.
Yeah, protest is a very much political activity, but it's also a social activity, and it's a performative activity. It does involve passing messages, utilizing symbols. Paula referred to symbols in her talk. So certainly there are ceremonial elements in protest activities. I think that it's a fantastic suggestion to study these elements, very, very important elements of the protest repertoire that you find in a country. That does require more ethnographic type of research. I live in Scotland, so surveys is easier for me to employ in my own research. But certainly, I would have a lot of interest in seeing the potential activities that are brought, and I think that it makes sense perhaps to look at what a historical context can provide in terms of ceremonies, in terms of culture, in terms of memories that have been forgotten, can be reactivated. What you proposed about running something that is perhaps goes back to religion or maybe anything in Greece is a fantastic idea. There will be an audience for that. It is more likely to appeal to type of protesters that have more conservative identities rather than more progressive liberal identities. But it's something that can be trialed by protest actors, and would like to study it.
Any other views from maybe Paula and Nebojša on maybe the methodology, or before we move on to the next question about the methodology of the protests? If you look at in Serbia, there is a lot of performative public action, choirs, plays, etc., which is combined. And Paula, I believe this was one of your first remarks where you said that they have to be constantly reinventing themselves and creative in order to I suppose either to engage the protesters and to keep the momentum going. And we will move on to the next question also that has to do with the kind of how Serbian protests are trying to constantly reinvent themselves and in a sense keep everybody in kind of suspense and expectations what it is that the students will come up next as a next way to engage the students and the wider public and the citizens. Mm-hmm.
If I could just make a short point, I think that the symbols and the performances and the creativity is really important for what Denisa just mentioned, the encouraging citizens to come out, new citizens to stay out beyond just one protest, because particularly in Southeastern Europe, I think we have like a politics of disappointment, right? Those who are engaging in the mobilization need to work very hard, very creatively to be listening to the different constituencies and what are their interests, what are their concerns, what will help snap them out of disappointment in the current system and just staying away and coping with
Nebojša?
Yeah, when it comes to symbols, there was an interesting debate in Serbia, kind of heated debate over why students and others do not bring EU flags into protests and why they just use Serbian flags. And for some, that was kind of the cause of concern because it kind of hints at nationalistic angle, kind of isolationist, and the rest of it. However, I think it is a slightly broader context that matters. One, these protests have been very inclusive, especially student protests, and protests of Serbs and Bosniaks in Novi Pazar have actually worked together very nicely, and some Bosniak students were reported to have said that for the first time they felt as true citizens of Serbia during these protests. So it has been largely inclusive. The second point is that students actually wanted to take the center ground. This regime, this government has systematically labeled any opponents as traitors of the nation, not patriotic, and criminals, and the rest of it. So they wanted to show that actually patriotism can be inclusive and kind of democratic in a way. And finally, why not EU flags? Well, the EU has been largely indifferent, not just to protests in Serbia these days, but to any kind of pro-democracy activists, those against corruption in the last decade or so in the wider region. So we had this international democracy promotion in the 1990s, early 2000s, but then we had kind of the low level of this. Still in rhetoric you have democracy promotion, but in reality it's about hard sort of interests, extraction of lithium, which European car industry needs. Macron needs to send most expensive fighter planes to Serbia, which Serbia doesn't need, but Vučić is buying support from Macron for himself. So that's why students were not that obsessed by the EU. So it's a little bit about symbolism.
Thank you, Nebojša, for raising that important dimension on the EU, which is rather paradoxical because here you have protests on unprecedented scales, people mobilizing in the name of the values that that lie at the heart of the European Union, right? The ideas of democracy and the rule of law. So here we have the next question is from Ivana Prica, who is from the Faculty of Economics at the University of Belgrade, asking about your, all the speakers' views about the possibilities of the cross-country support of the protesters. And I think we could take that in two ways. Both within the region, Southeast Europe, and more widely transnationally, as you mentioned, Nebojša. But it's kind of quite interesting whether there is any scope and whether the fact that we have protests over corruption that resulted in death in different countries, whether that is also playing a role in that protesters understand that there is this transnational idea of solidarity. Professor Prica is also asking about this latest, as I said, proposal and a project that a campaign within the campaign that the Serbian students have, and that is to cycle to the Council of Europe and basically protest the breaches of the rule of law in Serbia in order to draw attention and internationalize their cause, if you like. Paula, would you maybe have any ideas on this transnational dimension?
Well, a lot of the activists that we worked with talked about the importance of the transnational solidarity among, students, environmentalists, human rights advocates, women activists. I think they already have formed some pretty strong networks of communication about supporting one another and how it is they can learn from one another. I'm just wondering, though, about how that can be leveraged to help bolster the power, right, of the protesters in Serbia. And so I would leave that to Nebojša to be able to communicate how those transnational networks may be able to help. I would say that those in Hungary and in Poland, they have been interacting where civic activists have gone to the European Court. They've lobbied in Parliament for to raise consciousness about the violations of rights, as you mentioned, that are at the core of the European Union. And I think that is one mechanism that is helpful, but it needs to be done carefully, right? Because sometimes it feeds into the authoritarians and those who are opposed, their blaming of foreigners or that kind of activity of being traitorous, of kind of undermining the domestic institutions and the domestic interests. And so I think every calculation of solidarity, as Nebojša mentioned with the EU flag, needs to be kind of carefully considered.
Thank you, Paula. So before I ask Nebojša and Georgios to respond, I'm mindful of the time, and but we have one more question that we received. So I'll read out that question as well. So if you could pick it up too. This one is from Dimitri Sotiropoulos, who is a professor at the University of Athens. Question addressed to Nebojša. How and whether opposition parties in Serbia have reacted to the protests? Have opposition parties picked up in popularity in the polls? And how do you think the protesters view the opposition parties? Okay, so maybe Nebojša, if you could take those two questions on transnational dimension and this one. And Georgios, you did mention in your presentation the element of that kind of a global perspective in terms of human rights. I was quite interested to hear more about that. Nebojša.
When it comes to cross-country influences, they've been substantial in the last 2 decades, but not only when it comes to the opposition, but also when it comes to strategies of authoritarian manipulation. I was talking about the institutional context of protests, and if you take Aleksandar Vučić, he has learned from big guys, Orban and Erdogan. But also from smaller guys, Gruevski, North Macedonia, and Đukanović, especially in Montenegro. So, and he has learned from Milosevic's mistakes. That's why he doesn't use repression on a larger scale. At least he hasn't used it yet. So, I mean, there is clear cross-fertilization of strategies on that side, but you also see it when it comes to protesters. And I mentioned students and direct democracy, sort of plenums or plenary sessions, their decision-making and organization. And they actually borrowed it from students in the region. Students in Croatia used it in 2009 occupation of Faculty of Philosophy. Then I think students in Sarajevo and Tuzla, that was 2014, and then in North Macedonia, 2016. Now, the difference is that the focus in these protests was on student sort of issues, higher education, while in Serbia, it's very different. It's much broader kind of public issues. But, exactly the tactics were those and used very effectively. And you see kind of much broader encouragement when you see protests in other countries, especially their large-scale protests, if they engender political crisis. That has a major influence on protesters or potential protesters in other countries in the region. They kind of follow what's happening in the region. This has an effect. Those protesters in Macedonia in mid-2010s, they were strongly influenced by what happened in Serbia in 2000, and protesters today in Serbia are influenced by what happened in Macedonia a decade ago. So there's quite a lot of that these days. And when it comes to the opposition, yeah, that was Dimitri's question. That's actually very interesting. I mean, the opposition started this protest and pushed them while it was very difficult, when, well, there was some government repression in the first month when there wasn't that many people apart from in Novi Sad. But then when students took the center stage, then the opposition withdrew. And kind of focused on institutional protest, kind of blocking parliament, that sort of a thing, blocking local councils across Serbia, partly because students wanted the opposition not to meddle in their own protest, but partly because I think the opposition realized that the government cannot really use repression against students. That would be a step too far. So they are waiting until the government is fully undermined to get in. The problem is that may be a bit late, and my argument has been more recently that if the opposition doesn't step in very quickly, then we may end up with some sort of a populist alternative, which can be also authoritarian. So we may end up with regime change, but again, we end up with some other form of non-democratic rule.
Thank you, Nebojša. I'm mindful of the time, so Georgios, if you could do it in less than a minute or so.
Yeah, yes, the original question was about cross-national influences, and yes, we can see those. Yes, the 2011 Anaktismeni movement in Greece did mirror and was inspired by protests in Spain and the Arab Spring. But focusing on the second part of your question about global influences, transnational solidarity was mentioned by Paula. This is huge. This indicates that global cultural transformations and claims and social justice movements that have been internationally very salient in the last few years do impact on developments in Greece, produce attitudes in favor of demands for justice, and they can fuel through emotions primarily, but also through cross-national solidarity networks, demands and participation in protest activities.
Well, thank you so much. All I can do now is just thank all our panelists for this very insightful discussion that makes us think and understand these protests in new ways. The protests that are ongoing, so this is an issue that we will be following. I would like to thank everybody who has joined us, everybody who has listened, and all of you who have asked questions. And just to say that Hellenic Observatory has another event coming. This will be on 29th of April at 12:30 p.m. to 2 p.m. And it's the title, Searching for Growth Drivers, a Debate with Chief Economists of the Systemic Greek Banks. So do follow our events and do join us. And thank you very much for this evening. Thank you.